My father traded my mother's ghost for a parasite's embrace, then slapped me across the face and threw me into a sub-zero blizzard to die. He thought he erased Ayla. He thought he could bury my name under Letecia's lies and replace our history with her greed. He was dead wrong. 10 years later, I didn't come back to beg for a seat at his table. I came back as the cold forensic shadow that bought his entire life. The eviction notice is signed, the locks are changed, and the debt of blood betrayal is finally due for payment. But to understand the fire in my eyes today, you have to feel the ice where the sanctuary first began to rot. It was 100 days after the funeral when I finally returned to a house that no longer breathed for me. The tires of my old sedan crunched over the gravel driveway of the Hinsdale estate, a sound that usually signaled the end of a long day and the beginning of peace. But as I cut the engine, the silence that followed felt heavy, almost suffocating. It had been exactly 100 days since we laid my mother to rest under the ancient oaks of the local cemetery. 100 days of trying to navigate a house that had lost its North Star. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles pale in the dim dashboard light. Have you ever returned to a place that was supposed to be your sanctuary, only to find that your seat at the table has been quietly removed before the meal even started? That cold realization was already beginning to seep into my bones. I stepped through the heavy oak front door, expecting the faint, lingering scent of my mother's lavender sachets. Instead, a sharp chemical wave of industrial bleach and cheap synthetic floral air freshener hit me like a physical blow. It was aggressive. It was intrusive. My eyes darted to the foyer, searching for the familiar. The antique brass umbrella stand, a Victorian piece my mother had lovingly restored, was gone. In its place stood a sleek, soulless slab of cold marble that looked utterly alien against the 1920s woodwork. I felt a hollow ache in my chest as I realized that a house is not just brick and mortar. It is an altar to the lives lived within it. When the altar is desecrated, the god of the home has been officially banished. A shadow moved in the dimly lit hallway. My father, Gannon, stood there, his posture stooped as if he were carrying a burden he didn't want to admit to. He didn't look at me. His eyes remained fixed on a spot somewhere near my shoes, a physical manifestation of a growing cowardice I barely recognized. "You're late, Ayla," he mumbled, his voice thin and devoid of its usual warmth. He looked like a man who had already surrendered his fortress without a fight. Looking back now, I should have seen the betrayal written in the slump of his shoulders. I walked past him toward the back of the house, drawn by a sudden, frantic need to see the garden. I pulled back the heavy drapes of the morning room and my breath hitched. The horror was absolute. The heirloom peony garden, the one my mother had tended for 30 years, the flowers she called her living legacy, was gone. In its place was a flat, hideous expanse of gray artificial turf. It looked like a graveyard for nature. Before I could even find my voice, the kitchen door swung open and the true invasion began. Letecia stepped out, a glass of Chardonnay in one hand, wearing my mother's vintage silk robe. Seeing that sacred garment on her felt like a jagged blade across my skin. She didn't offer a greeting. She offered a predatory smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Ayla, you're home." I decided it was time to refresh the energy of this place. Your father and I agreed it was time to stop living in a museum of the deceased. Behind her, 2 teenagers I'd never met, Sable and Vane, were already sprawled on the hand-woven Persian rug, tossing their designer sneakers onto the delicate fibers mother had spent years protecting. I didn't scream. I didn't throw a tantrum. Instead, a profound, icy pity washed over me. I remembered my mother once telling me that true dignity is not found in what you take, but in the grace you maintain when everything is being taken from you. I looked at Letecia, then at the strangers in our living room, and finally at Gannon, who had followed me into the room like a well-trained shadow. I realized then that I wasn't just being inconvenienced. I was being replaced. The house needed new life, Gannon said, finally finding his voice, though it sounded rehearsed. Letecia has an eye for aesthetics. You should be grateful, Ayla. It's been so gloomy here. He spoke as if the last 20 years of our lives were a burden he was eager to discard. Under Illinois probate law, I knew he had the right of residency, But the way they were moving, it was clear they were treating the title as if it had already been cleared in his name alone. They were acting with a sense of entitlement that bypassed legal reality and headed straight for theft. I didn't argue. I simply turned and headed for the stairs. "I'm going to my room," I said, my voice steady, surprising even myself. I needed a moment of silence to calculate my next move, but when I reached my door and turned the handle, it wouldn't budge. I tried again, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. The lock had been changed. A cold sweat broke out on my neck as I realized the vanity in the hallway had been cleared of my mother's jewelry box. They weren't just moving furniture. They were moving to erase my existence. I eventually found Gannon in his study, my voice a whisper of controlled fury. "Why is my room locked, Dad?" He didn't look up from his desk. "Letecia thought Sable needed the extra space for her influencer equipment. Your things are in the attic, Ayla. It's for the best." I stood there, the silence ringing in my ears. I took a deep breath, centering myself on the stoic principle that while they could move my furniture, they could never move my mind. The best revenge, I decided, was to not be like the man who performed the injury. I walked up to the cramped, dusty attic and sat on the floor amidst the boxes of my life. The air was stale, but it was the only place left that didn't smell of Letecia. As I looked around, trying to find a spark of hope, my eyes caught a small, blinking red light in the corner near the ceiling. I froze. It was a small, hidden camera, angled directly at the small cot they had set up for me. It wasn't just a move-in, it was a psychological siege. They wanted to watch me break. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. The lens of the hidden camera flickered with a tiny red light, a predatory eye watching Ayla's every move as she realized her privacy was no longer her own. The blinking red eye in the corner of my ceiling didn't just watch me. It followed me into my dreams, a digital predator waiting for a slip. I spent the first few nights in that attic paralyzed, staring back at the lens until my eyes burned. But by the second week, the overt surveillance merged with a more suffocating form of domestic theater. Letecia had transformed our historic Hinsdale home into a backdrop for her curated life. Every evening was a rehearsal for a perfect family dinner that felt more like a hostage situation than a meal. Have you ever felt like an extra in your own life, forced to smile while someone else tears down your sanctuary piece by piece? Tonight, the dining table groaned under the weight of silver platters and crystal that Letecia had unearthed from my mother's forbidden cabinets. The candles flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the Victorian wallpaper. Letecia spent the first 10 minutes adjusting the lighting and posing Gannon, Sable, and Vane for a group photo. "Healing hearts through togetherness," she murmured as she tapped the upload button on her phone. I sat at the far end of the table, a ghost at the feast. Gannon smiled at her with a vacant, adoring warmth that turned my stomach. He seemed to have forgotten the very scent of the woman who used to sit in that chair. Beneath the tablecloth, the reality was much grimmer. Vane and Sable took turns digging the toes of their designer sneakers into my shins. Each kick was accompanied by a hissed insult, words like freeloader and mental case drifting across the table like smoke. Gannon sat there, seemingly deaf to the vitriol, his focus entirely on Letecia's praises. Looking back, I realized that some people build their happiness on the wreckage of others' lives, and my father was the willing architect of my ruin. I kept my head down, repeating my mother's mantra. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. My academic future was my only exit strategy. The dinner took a darker turn when I looked at my plate. Letecia had served a cream-based scallop risotto, two things she knew I was severely allergic to. It was a subtle, lethal test of my limits. When I quietly pushed the plate away, Gannon frowned. "Ayla, don't be difficult. Letecia spent hours on this. Show some gratitude for her kindness." He was completely oblivious to the danger, blinded by the sugar-coated poison she served daily. I simply took a piece of dry bread, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I chose to stay silent to keep a fragile peace, not knowing that peace was actually a trap. By the time I retreated to my attic room, my head was spinning. For the last few nights, Letecia had insisted on bringing me a reconciliation herbal tea before bed. It had a strange, metallic aftertaste that I initially attributed to the bitterness of my grief. But as I sat at my desk to study, The words on the page began to swim. My heart rate accelerated, yet my limbs felt like lead. A heavy pharmaceutical fog descended over my thoughts, blurring the edges of the room. It was a sensory distortion I couldn't explain. I didn't realize it then, but the siege had moved from my environment into my very blood. The haze became a weapon during my next study session. Vane burst into the room, accidentally knocking a glass of grape juice across my mother's original college diploma. The purple stain spread like a bruise over the parchment. I felt a surge of uncharacteristic, jagged rage, a chemical fire fueled by the drugs in my system. I stood up, my chair clattering back, and screamed at him to get out. Within seconds, Letecia appeared in the doorway, her phone already recording my outburst. Her face was a mask of feigned concern, but her eyes were cold and triumphant. The camera zoomed in on my face, capturing my dilated pupils and my slurred, frantic defense. I looked like the unstable girl she had been describing to my father. "See, Gannon?" she whispered later that evening, her voice carrying through the vents. "She's dangerously erratic. She needs supervision, maybe a higher level of medication." I slumped against the wall, trying to process the world through a fog that wasn't my own. Despite the drugged heat in my veins, I refused to go downstairs and retaliate. Anger is a brief madness, and I refused to let her poison define my character. Searching for clarity, I waited until the house went silent and crept down to the kitchen. In the back of the spice cabinet, I found a small, unlabeled brown bottle. The pills inside matched the description of a potent sedative often used to manage difficult patients. My fatigue wasn't a byproduct of grief. It was a planned chemical suppression. My hands shook as I realized Letecia wasn't just taking my room or my garden. She was trying to take my mind. I recalled a truth my grandfather once told me. The mind is its own place, and it can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. I knew I needed forensic proof if I was going to survive this legally. Using a sterile glass vial from my chemistry kit, I poured a sample of the drug tea into it and hid it inside the hollowed-out lining of my suitcase. My movements were slow and clumsy, every thought a battle against the lethargy dragging me down. Gannon looked at me with such profound disappointment when I passed him in the hall, seeing only the addict Letecia had painted. It hurt more than the drugs. I wanted to tell him the truth, but the words died in my throat, slurred and useless. The final blow came as I sat on the attic stairs, my head resting against the banister. Through the cracks in the floorboards above Gannon's office, I heard their hushed voices. They weren't talking about my health. They were discussing a probate hearing and limited power of attorney. The words chilled me more than the Chicago winter. They were moving to strip me of my legal identity and my right to the inheritance my mother had bled to protect. I watched through the shadows as Gannon's hand moved across a document, his signature effectively signing away my future. The heavy door of the office creaked open just a fraction, revealing Gannon's signature on a document that effectively signed away Ayla's right to her own inheritance. The digital eye in my ceiling wasn't the only thing recording my life anymore. I had started recording theirs. I stood in the shadows of the upstairs hallway, watching Gannon's hand move across the heavy vellum of a document that effectively erased my adulthood. The scratch of his pen sounded like a bone breaking. I didn't realize it then, but watching my father sign away my future was the moment I stopped being a victim and started being a witness. Have you ever felt the person who was supposed to be your anchor become the very weight that tries to drown you? That cold, hollow realization doesn't just hurt. It changes the chemistry of your soul. 3 days later, I was summoned to a routine family meeting at a prestigious law office in downtown Chicago. The air in the elevator was sterile, smelling of expensive cologne and old secrets. When the doors opened, I found Gannon and Letecia already huddled with a notary in a glass-walled conference room. They were sitting across from Silas, a man with graying temples and sharp eyes who had been my mother's trusted attorney for decades. Gannon refused to look at me, hiding behind a mountain of paperwork that Letecia was eagerly pushing toward him. The room smelled of expensive ink and the rot of a dying family bond. I took my seat, the silence ringing in my ears. Gannon's eyes remained fixed on his fingernails, a physical manifestation of his shame. Looking back now, I should have seen it coming. I remembered my mother once told me that character is destiny. Watching Gannon cower behind Letecia's polished facade, I realized his lack of character had finally sealed his fate. I didn't feel rage. I felt a profound, aching pity for the shell of a man he had become. He was treating me like a stranger, an obstacle to be managed rather than the daughter he had once cradled. "Ayla, dear," Letecia began, her voice dripping with a sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Given your recent instability and medical needs, your father and I feel it's best to simplify things." Silas cleared his throat, his face a mask of professional neutrality. He revealed the true purpose of the meeting. Gannon was signing a petition for a limited guardianship. Under the guise of protection, they were claiming I was incapable of managing the peony trust my mother had left me. They were using the very pharmaceutical fog they had forced upon me as the evidence for my undoing. The blood betrayal wasn't just a metaphor, it was a legal execution. Gannon reached for the pen, his hand trembling slightly. I watched in slow motion as the nib touched the paper, the stroke of the pen sounding like a death knell. With that one signature, he was handing Letecia the keys to my financial independence. I reached out and placed my hand on Gannon's arm. "I forgive you for being afraid, Dad," I whispered, my voice steady despite the chaos in my chest. "But I cannot follow you into this darkness." Gannon flinched but didn't stop. The notary pressed the seal into the paper, a cold, mechanical thud that echoed through the room. But as the haze of the drugs from the previous weeks finally began to lift, a terrifying crystalline clarity took its place. I leaned back, my eyes narrowing as I memorized the serial number on the notary seal. I noticed Silas's hand twitch slightly as he shifted a second set of documents. He had left a specific legal loophole in the wording, a 30-day window to contest. My mother's old friend was throwing me a lifeline that Letecia was too arrogant to notice. Back at the Hinsdale estate, the victory party had already begun in Letecia's mind. She didn't wait for the ink to dry before ordering a professional locksmith to the house. I watched from the shadows of the library as they began changing the codes to the heavy steel safe where my mother had kept the original deeds and her personal letters. My home had officially become a battlefield where the weapons were bank passwords and forged signatures. I realized then that they thought they had taken my world, but they had only taken the things in it. My soul was still my own property. I began my own forensic journey that night. While the house slept, I moved like a ghost, secretly photographing the unlabeled pill bottles in Letecia's cabinet and the suspicious entries in the family ledger. Gannon was too blind to see the discrepancy, but I wasn't. I was looking for the truth behind the sugarcoating, and I was finding more than just sedatives. I was finding the trail of a woman who had been planning this long before my mother's heart stopped beating. I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but I knew I wouldn't be meeting it unarmed. As I sifted through the digital files on the library computer, I stumbled upon a hidden clause in the primary trust that both Letecia and Gannon had missed. It was a moral turpitude trigger, a clause that would revert the entire estate to me if the primary residence was mismanaged or used for illegal gains. My mother was still protecting me, even from the grave. I sat there in the dark, the first snowflake of the season hitting the library window. It was a cold omen of the night Gannon would finally choose the woman he barely knew over his own flesh and blood. The winter air was beginning to seep through the Victorian glass, chilling the room to its core. I looked at the documents on the screen, the first thread of a 10-year plan beginning to form in my mind. I wasn't going to fight them with screams or tears. I was going to fight them with the very laws they thought they had mastered. I didn't realize it then, but the storm that was coming would be much colder than the Chicago blizzard outside. The heavy door of the law office had clicked shut behind me weeks ago, but the echo of that signature remained. I walked through the halls of the Hinsdale estate, watching the winter storm gather strength outside, knowing that the next time I walked through those doors, I wouldn't be the one who had to leave. I had spent years thinking I was a part of this house, but I was quickly learning that I was merely a tenant in a structure built on lies. Have you ever stood in your own home and felt like a ghost, watching strangers rearrange the furniture of your life while you were still breathing? The blizzard hit Chicago with a violent, suffocating intensity that evening. I returned to my attic room, hoping for a few hours of study, only to find the door kicked open and my world turned upside down once again. Letecia was standing by the open library safe, the one she had changed the codes to in her frantic grab for control. Her hair was disheveled, and a thin line of blood ran down her arm from a self-inflicted scratch. She looked at me not with fear, but with a cold, calculated triumph that made my stomach turn. Before I could speak, she began to scream. "Gannon! Gannon! Help me! She's attacking me!" Her voice tore through the quiet house like a jagged blade. My father burst into the room, his face flushed with panic. Letecia pointed a trembling finger at me, tears streaming down her face. "She tried to take it, Gannon. She said I didn't deserve to wear her mother's skin. She tried to steal the ring." As if on cue, Letecia reached toward me, and I felt a heavy object slip from the pocket of my winter coat, the very coat she had borrowed earlier that day. My mother's primary diamond heirloom ring clattered onto the hardwood floor, its brilliance mocking the ugliness of the scene. Gannon stared at the evidence, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and disgust. Letecia whispered just loud enough for him to hear. "She's dangerous, Gannon. I told you the medication wasn't enough." I stood perfectly still, my heart breaking not for the jewelry, but for the man who was choosing a masterfully crafted lie over his own daughter's soul. Looking back now, I realize that some people don't want the truth, they want the comfort of a convenient villain. Gannon stepped toward me, his hand raised. The impact of the slap was a slow-motion shock that vibrated through my skull. The first and last time he would ever lay a hand on me. It was the blood diamond sting, a final rejection of every vow he had made to my mother. "You are a thief and a monster," he shouted, his voice cracking with a hatred that felt ancient. "I want you out of this house before the police arrive. I won't have a criminal under my roof." I didn't beg for him to listen. I didn't cry. I simply wiped the blood from my lip, feeling a terrifying, stoic calm settle over me. I remembered the phrase, "The best revenge is to not be like your enemy." I reached down, picked up my duffel bag, which Letecia had already packed and left by the door, and looked Gannon in the eye. "I'm not leaving because I'm guilty," I said, my voice as cold as the wind outside. "I'm leaving because you've finally shown me who you are." I walked out into the sub-zero Chicago night without a coat, realizing that he hadn't just kicked me out of a house. He had kicked me out of his heart. Under Illinois law, a homeowner can force a resident out during a domestic dispute if there is an immediate threat of violence. Letecia had studied the law well enough to weaponize it against a 17-year-old. I trudged through the deep, biting snow toward my grandparents' house, the only shelter I had left. But as I approached the iron gates, I found them locked tight. The lights inside were dark, and a single note was taped to the glass of the front door. It was Letecia's handwriting. The note explained that Letecia had preemptively called my grandparents, crying about my violent relapse and the stolen family silver. She had warned them that opening the door would only enable my addiction and put them in danger. I stood there, my fingers turning blue, realizing that the bridge back to my family had been burned from both ends. I was 18, homeless, and utterly alone in a city that didn't care if I froze. I made my way to the local CTA train station, the hum of the electric tracks the only sound in the frozen night. I sat on a wooden bench, my breath coming in shallow plumes, clutching the one thing Letecia had missed, the original trust documents I had hidden in the soles of my boots weeks ago. I wasn't just a girl in the cold anymore. I was the holder of a debt that would one day come due. "You didn't just kick me out," I whispered to the empty, howling night. "You set me free from the lie of your love." As the train pulled into the station, I looked at my reflection in the dirty, scratched window. The girl who had tried to please her father was gone, buried under the Chicago snow. In her place stood a woman who was already calculating the interest on the betrayal Gannon had just committed. I didn't realize it then, but this was the start of the 10-year silence that would eventually become his undoing. Closure doesn't come from an apology. It comes from the quiet moment you realize you finally belong to yourself. The train doors hissed shut, carrying me away from the only home I had ever known, and into a 10-year silence that would eventually become Gannon's undoing. I leaned my forehead against the cold, vibrating glass of the window, watching the lights of Hinsdale blur into streaks of amber and white. That night, I wasn't just a girl shivering in a thin coat. I was a girl who had finally understood that blood doesn't make a family. Loyalty does. I didn't realize it then, but that freezing journey was the start of a silent, decade-long reconstruction of my soul. They say silence is a sign of weakness, but have you ever noticed that the loudest part of a storm is the moment just before it breaks? 10 years later, I sit in my glass-walled office in the Chicago Loop, the city's skyline a jagged crown of steel beneath a rain-slicked sky. My name, Ayla, is etched in gold on the door, followed by the title of Senior Forensic Accountant. I've rebuilt myself into a woman whose mind is a fortress of numbers and logic. I spend my days tracing digital trails and unearthing the rot hidden in corporate ledgers. It's a clean, clinical life, miles away from the emotional chaos of my youth. I live by a simple principle. The best revenge is to live well. But for me, living well also means reclaiming the altar my mother built. My monitor flickers as I review a thick stack of public records I've been monitoring for months. Among the bank foreclosure notices and tax lien documents, a specific address flashes like a warning light. The Hinsdale estate, my childhood home. I trace the mortgage history with a steady hand, my fingers cool against the mouse. Gannon has defaulted on 3 consecutive payments. The interest is mounting and the house is officially headed for a sheriff's sale. Looking back now, I should have seen it coming. A house held together by lies can never stand for long. I lean back, the leather of my chair creaking in the quiet office. I haven't been forgotten. I've been erased from their lives. But they are about to learn that erasures can be undone. I've spent a decade accumulating the quiet power that comes with financial autonomy. Every penny I earned was a brick I was laying for my return. Reclaiming my mother's home isn't just about property. It's about restoring a desecrated sanctuary. I realize now that my silence wasn't a retreat, but a strategic gathering of force. While digging into Gannon's failing business accounts to assess his solvency, I stumble upon a shadow trail that turns my clinical detachment into moral disgust. Letecia hasn't just been a bad stepmother. She's been using my mother's home as a laundromat for dirty money, funneling funds to her criminal ex-husband. She turned a place of love into a den of parasites. It's a desecration that hits harder than any slap Gannon ever delivered. I watch the data flow across the screen with surgical precision. Gannon isn't just a victim of Letecia's charms anymore. He is a silent accomplice to the destruction of my mother's legacy. I see his signature on documents he clearly didn't read, blinded by the very woman who is bleeding him dry. My heart gives a small, involuntary twitch of pity. I think of his declining health, the frailness I saw in his eyes 10 years ago, and I wonder if she is still medicating him into compliance. Justice delayed is not justice denied. It is merely justice preparing its evidence. The rain drums rhythmically against my window, a hollow sound that echoes the 10-year void between me and my father. Suddenly, my personal cell phone buzzes, a number I haven't seen in a decade. I pick it up, my voice a calm, professional shield. Hello? The voice on the other end is frail, desperate, and laden with a shame so heavy I can feel it through the line. It's Gannon. He doesn't ask how I am. He doesn't ask where I've been. He only talks about a bridge loan and how Letecia is devastated at the prospect of losing their home. I listen to him repeat the same scripted lies Letecia has clearly fed him, realizing that his love for his daughter was successfully replaced by his fear of the woman who is ruining him. He treats me like a bank, not a daughter. I record every second of the call, the forensic evidence of his desperation mounting. I feel a twinge of humanitarian concern for the broken man he's become, but I know I must remain detached. I heard you, Gannon, I say, my voice as steady as still water. I will handle the matter of the house. You have my word. There is no warmth in my promise, only the cold certainty of an auditor closing an account. He thanks me, his voice breaking, never realizing that the hand reaching out to save him is the one that is about to dismantle his entire world. I hang up the phone and turn to Silas, who has been waiting in the shadows of my office. He looks at me with a grim, knowing smile. The parasite has finished eating, I say, my eyes reflecting the cold lights of the city. It's time to remove the host. I pick up my pen and prepare the wire transfer that will turn me into the invisible landlord of the Hinsdale estate. I didn't realize it then, but the storm I was about to unleash would be much colder than the Chicago blizzard that once tried to kill me. The electronic ink on my money order didn't just transfer money, it transferred destiny. As my signature reached the end of that document, I felt a decade of suffocating pressure of being wiped out finally begin to shift. I had deposited millions of dollars into an escrow account which would transform me from Gannon's forgotten daughter into his new, invisible master. The storm I was unleashing was a precise, cold calculation, far colder than the Chicago blizzard that had nearly killed me. I sat in my office, watching the confirmation lights flash on the screen, knowing the end had begun. Have you ever realized that true power isn't the ability to strike, but the ability to wait until that strike serves absolute justice? The morning of the sheriff's sale felt like a funeral for a ghost. I stood in the back of a sterile county courthouse in downtown Chicago, the air smelling of floor wax and the low hum of bureaucratic indifference. Gannon and Letecia were nowhere to be seen. They were likely at the Hinsdale estate, arrogantly sipping wine, convinced their latest legal delay would hold. They didn't realize that I had spent 10 years studying the very laws they tried to bend. I operated through Silas and Peony Legacy LLC, a name that served as both a shield and a tribute to the garden they had raised. The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic drone, calling out the fate of my mother's home. I watched as several predatory developers made their bids, their eyes greedy for the Victorian woodwork and the prime acreage. I let them play for a while. Then I gave Silas the nod. Our bids were surgical, pre-calculated to cover the exact amount of Gannon's debt plus the back taxes Letecia had pocketed. One by one, the developers dropped out. The room went silent. The gavel dropped with a final, echoing thud. "It's yours, Ayla," Silas whispered, leaning in. "Legally, the title is being recorded in the name of the LLC as we speak." I was now the landlord of the people who had abandoned me. I felt no joy at Gannon's downfall, only a heavy, relieved feeling that the house was finally safe from his weakness. I pondered the moral dilemma of driving my father away, but then I remembered the night he slapped me in the snow. Forgiveness did not mean allowing a thief to keep the keys to my sacred home. I was reclaiming the altar, not out of hatred, but out of a steadfast necessity to protect what remained of my mother's dignity. The transformation from daughter to a cold instrument of the law was complete. In retrospect, I realized that some silences were not surrenders, but blueprints for a complete restoration. Letecia discovered through a back-channel contact that an anonymous entity had bought the debt, and her panic reached a fever pitch. She knew that a forensic audit of the property's history was inevitable. Fearing her money laundering records would be discovered, she initiated a scorched earth counteroffensive. I arrived at the perimeter of the property that afternoon to see a thin, acrid ribbon of smoke rising from the basement windows. The smell of burning paper and chemical accelerant filled the air. The sensory overload was immediate, the frantic sound of a shredder running upstairs, and the dull glow of a staged, accidental fire below. Gannon stood in the middle of the living room, paralyzed by Letecia's screaming commands. He looked at the smoke, finally realizing that the woman he had chosen over me was literally burning down the legacy of the woman he had once loved. He looked like a man waking up in the middle of a plane crash. I didn't call him. I didn't rush in to save him. Instead, I called my prearranged contacts at the IRS and the FBI, handing over the digital forensic files I'd been building for years. Humanitarian concern wrestled with my resolve as I watched the smoke thicken. I wondered if Letecia had been medicating Gannon into this state of paralysis, just as she had done to me. I felt a twinge of daughterly pain, but I forced myself to remain detached. I could not save a man who was determined to drown with his captor. To save the house, I had to let Letecia's crimes be fully exposed, even if Gannon was caught in the collateral damage. Justice is not a scalpel. Sometimes it is a landslide that takes everything in its path. I had to believe that the truth, like the stone foundation of this house, would survive the fire. I walked up the driveway, my heels clicking on the pavement with a sharp, decisive rhythm. Letecia met me on the front porch, her face a mask of frantic intimidation. "You have no right to be here, Ayla. Get off this property before I call the police for harassment," she screamed, her voice cracking. She threatened a lawsuit for economic espionage, her desperation showing through the cracks of her polished facade. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached into my briefcase and pulled out a certified folder. I handed her the newly recorded deed of ownership and a 24-hour notice of eviction authorized by the Cook County Sheriff. The color drained from her face, leaving it the color of ash. "I am not here as your daughter, Gannon," I said, looking past her to the broken man in the hallway. "I am here as the owner of this property, and I am reporting an active arson attempt and tax evasion to the authorities who just pulled into the driveway." As the sirens began to wail in the distance, I felt the last of the sugar-coating dissolve, leaving only the bitter reality of their actions. Ayla stood her ground, her silhouette framed by the rising smoke, the very image of a woman who had outgrown her own trauma. I told myself that the best revenge is to be unlike those who hurt you, yet I knew this was more than revenge. It was a restoration of order. I looked at the charred remains of the basement files drifting in the wind and thought, "You tried to burn the evidence, but you forgot that the truth is etched into the stone of this foundation. You can destroy the papers, but you can't destroy the memory of the one who truly built this home." As the IRS agents and the sheriff's deputies flooded the lawn, Letecia's screams turned into hysterical pleas. Gannon just sat on the porch steps, his head in his hands, finally seeing the abyss he had fallen into. I didn't look back as I walked towards Silas, who was holding a second, smaller key. It was the key to the master suite, the room I had spent the last month secretly restoring, piece by piece, to its original state. This wasn't the end of the night. It was the preparation for the final psychological confrontation. The parasites had been removed, but the sanctuary still needed to be reclaimed from the ghosts. The sirens grew louder, a chorus of real-world consequences finally arriving at the Hinsdale estate. I took the key from Silas, my hand steady, my mind crystalline. The blue and red lights reflected off the Victorian windows as I stepped over the threshold, finally walking into the house not as a guest or a ghost, but as the master of my mother's domain. I didn't know what the final conversation with Gannon would bring, but I knew I was ready. The altar was waiting, and for the first time in 10 years, the air inside felt like it belonged to me. I stood in the grand foyer of the Hinsdale estate, my shadow stretching across the polished hardwood floor that had once been my playground. The house was humming with a frantic, artificial energy. Letecia, desperate to maintain a social standing that had already crumbled into the Chicago dirt, was hosting an emergency gala. She called it a celebration of a legal victory that didn't exist. A final, hollow performance for a society that was already whispering about the federal agents at the gate. Looking back now, I see that no man or woman is truly free who is a slave to their own fear. The ballroom was filled with the clinking of crystal and the forced laughter of Hinsdale's elite. Letecia was at the center of it, bragging to her friends about how she had outsmarted the anonymous entity trying to take her home. I moved through the shadows, a ghost finally reclaimed by the flesh. While she was busy spinning her lies, I used my master key to unlock the master suite. For weeks, I had sent a team to restore this room in secret, piece by piece. I had recreated the room exactly as it was the day my mother died. The specific lavender perfume, the precise arrangement of the lace pillows, even the soft hum of her favorite cello concerto playing from a hidden speaker. I stood in the doorway and watched Letecia enter the room to freshen her makeup. The change in the air hit her like a physical blow. She froze, her hand flying to her throat as the scent of my mother's presence filled her lungs. She stared at the vanity, seeing the jewelry box she had once stolen, now sitting exactly where it belonged. It was a psychological shock that stripped away her mask. I watched her crumble into a state of irrational terror, her own guilt acting as the harshest jailer I could ever have hired. I stood there, a living testament to the legacy she tried to burn, and I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Her panic was her confession. The tension in the house reached a breaking point as I descended the grand staircase. The music in the ballroom faltered and then died as the front doors were thrown open. The Cook County Sheriff and 2 FBI agents stepped into the light, their presence a cold, clinical contrast to the glitter of the party. I reached the bottom step just as the crowd parted. In front of Hinsdale's high society, I presented the original Peony Trust documents and the sheriff's deed. "My name is Ayla," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. "And I am the sole owner of the soil you are standing on." Gannon stepped forward, his face a map of broken pride and confusion. He looked at the documents, then at me, and finally at the agents who were already moving towards Letecia. He tried to speak, his voice a frail tremor of an apology 10 years too late. "Ayla, I didn't know. I was told—" I stopped him with a gentle but firm gesture. "You chose a stranger's lies over your daughter's truth, Gannon. I have no more room in my life for your excuses, but I have plenty of room for justice." The silence that followed was the heaviest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of the family bond finally turning to ash. I turned my attention to Sable in vain, caught red-handed trying to sneak out the back door with luggage full of stolen valuables. My evidence was so clear and lucid that their lawyer didn't even attempt a defense. I gave them a formal eviction notice within 24 hours, my hands steady, my heart at peace. Letecia was led away in handcuffs, her screams echoing through the very walls she had tried to occupy. Have you ever experienced anything like this? Have you ever witnessed someone's walls of lies finally crumble? I stood there as the parasites were driven away, feeling a profound, resilient liberation that I had forgotten was possible. The following morning, the Hinsdale estate was finally quiet. I stood on the porch, the very porch Gannon had chased me away from that cold winter night, and watched the last moving truck disappear down the driveway. I felt nothing, just a profound sense of peace. That morning, I had sent Silas with a small check to Gannon. It wasn't a debt, nor a gift. It was payment for the meals he had cooked for me when I was a child. It was a humane gesture to end things, a final formal settlement that severed the last remaining connection between us. I was no longer a girl waiting for a love that would never come. I walked into the backyard where my team had spent the night replanting the heirloom peonies. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, cinematic glow over the Victorian brickwork. I knelt in the dirt, my fingers touching the soft, cool petals of a bloom that looked exactly like the ones my mother once held. I felt her presence then, not as a ghost, but as a blessing. I didn't win this battle out of a desire for revenge. I won by choosing a life where they no longer had the power to hurt me. Closure doesn't come from an apology from those who betrayed you. It comes from the quiet moment you realize you finally belong to yourself. I know many of you have built your own lives from the ashes of betrayal. I know the weight of being erased and the long, lonely road back to your own name. Tell me your story. How did you find your way back home? What was the moment you realized you were finally free? I read every one of your stories because I know that our shared strength is what keeps the altar lit. As the first evening star appeared over the garden, I stood up and walked back into my house. One by one, I turned on the lights in the windows, signaling to the world that the sanctuary was restored.